Warning! Tube amplifiers have lethal voltages inside them. Please do not attempt to build, test, or repair these without understanding and following all safety protocols. Hey y'all! Well, we're here for another round with the R300, and in this episode, I'm going to try to look at some simple ways to resolve the major power supply issue, which is the rectifier tubes arcing out. And I think one of the biggest problems are these 274B tubes. Now, pretty sure they picked these tubes because they wanted to match the 300B tubes. And it was definitely, I feel, an aesthetic choice, given that the original schematic for this amp shows a 5AR4 like in the schematic, but then they put these in. And obviously, these little short bottle 5AR4s, they sit down in this little hole here, and, these have a much more commanding look to them. But the other issue with these is, look how little space there is between these two bottles. And these things get super hot. I don't think that's good for the amplifier. These little shorty guys are nowhere near the tube. They put off a lot less heat. And as you'll see in the following segment, they just are better performers. And so, again, the purpose of this video is for you guys out there that maybe have these amps and are concerned about, some of the things you've been reading online about these rectifier tubes arcing, and now you're seeing that the capacitors may be way beyond what these were designed to be able to handle. I think the 5AR4s can handle it. Now, the other thing that I've run into or found out about is, I want to get this out of here. I think the amp looks so much better with these in. It really makes the 300B tubes stand out on their own, which is what is supposed to be about, is, the 300B tubes. But anyway, speaking of 300B tubes, I've had 5 different people report to me that they bought Gold Lion 300B tubes, put them in the amp, and they red plated, even with the bias set in the center. And we'll get into that, but center on this meter is about 80% of the dissipation and just a little over 30 watts, which should not make them red plate. So I think there's an issue with those Gold Lion tubes, the way they were manufactured. I don't know if, people are selling possibly factory rejects on eBay or where people are getting those tubes from. I'm sure some of y'all are getting them from legit dealers, but again, the dealers just buy what they are supplied with, and they can't control, obviously the quality control or whatever. The 2 Electro-Harmonics tubes I've got, one of them has got an issue when you first turn it on of makes a bunch of weird crackling and popping in one speaker until it gets some temperature in it, which isn't good. So that's telling me that the quality control possibly on those isn't great either. I have had very good luck with the Shuggy 300B-Z tubes, but limited supply of those. They're no longer in production. There's a couple of places that still have some for sale, but they're few and far between. So, those are going to disappear soon. So, I'm not sure what the good 300B tubes are today. Obviously, the Western Electric ones are good, but they're almost the price of this amplifier. They're, $1,200 for a pair of them? So that's one of the problems with a 300B amp is these direct heated triode tubes are just really expensive to try to get some good quality ones. So I'm starting to think that with these 300B Gold Lion tubes red plating, it's not the amplifier, it's the tubes. Or else there wouldn't be so many people. And The other thing that I've discovered since I started working on this is there seems to be two versions of this amp, or at least two. There may be more. Mine has a voltage delay board in it, but it also seems to have a different power supply capacitor board as well. And then looking at pictures of that other board, it's got a 220 UF cap where my board has 100 UF. And again, I haven't disassembled this amp and pulled that board out and reverse engineered looking at the traces to see which one of those two capacitors is the actual first capacitor in the power supply, because there's two 100 UF caps right next to each other in this amp, and it's weird. One of them is black and bigger in diameter, and the other one's brown and a little smaller in diameter, but they're both rated 100 UF 450 volt, so I'm not sure why there's two different caps in the amp. Anyway, there's somebody here locally that lives fairly close by that has the earlier version of this amp. And I've got some stuff I've got to deal with later this week, so it may end up being a couple of weeks before I can get this amp over here and look at that one. But there definitely are two different versions. So today, I can only talk about the version that I have here in testing it with 5AR4 tubes and the measurements I got and how to bias the amp to work with these tubes, and we'll get into that shortly. So anyway, again, I hope to get the other version in front of me, and then we are going to dive into doing internal power supply mods on this amp as well. But first I wanted to see if there was like a drop-in tube solution for folks that maybe aren't comfortable diving inside the amp. So let's look at how this amp behaves just dropping a couple of 5AR4 tubes in it. Okay, so I'm going to show you the voltage rise on the plate of the 300B tube with the 5AR4 tubes in, with the delay board still in the amplifier. And we turned it on. And as you can see, there's just a couple of volts left in the capacitors from the last time I powered this on. And we're waiting. Got a timer here on this board. It's got a 555 IC chip that sets the delay, and there it went. And as you can see, it's like turning on a light switch. It goes from 1 volt to 425, just bam, all in one shot. So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to put a couple of jumpers leads in here to jump across this relay board and show you what the voltage ramp up looks like just using the 5AR4 without this delay board. Okay, after I let the capacitors drain down, I installed some jumper leads that go straight from the transformer output to the plates of each of the 5AR4s, bypassing the delay board, which is one of the modifications I'm planning on doing. And I want to show you why. So I'm clicking it on, and as you can see, got no voltage. And then here's single digit. There's 20, 100, 200, 400. And that's what an indirectly heated rectifier tube does, is it slowly ramps in the voltage instead of flicking it on like a light switch. And that allows the other tubes in the amplifier to let the heaters kind of get a head start on the voltage coming in. But then as the voltage comes in, it rolls in slowly and doesn't have the inrush current spike like you would have even with the delay board, because the delay board, you're sitting at 0 volts, and then when the relay clicks, it's 400, and it's got to instantly charge up those capacitors through just a few cycles of the AC, where with the slowly warming up rectifier tubes, as you saw, it's 20 volts, 30 volts, and that sort of thing. And while it may not look like a lot in time for us, in terms of AC cycles, it's an eternity. And it gives it a nice, slow ramp up of the voltage coming into the amplifier. So that's what we're planning on doing, is pulling out this delay board, jumping this. And for you folks that don't have a delay board, good news, you don't need one if you put some 5AR4s in your amp. So let's go over what I found with these two rectifier tubes and what the marks on the meter represent. So the far left mark on the meter of the hash lines is equal to 67 milliamps of current through the tube. Dead center is 80 milliamps, and on the far right mark, of the hash marks that are in the center part of the meter, the far right one is 90 milliamps. And then if you go one tick mark left of the center, that's 76 milliamps. And that's important later. I'll show you why. So with the 274B rectifier tubes, and this line here is the plate voltages measured. When the bias is set at 67 milliamps, we got 409 volts. We have 27.5 watts of dissipation out of the 40 the tube's rated for, which means we're running it at 68.5% of its maximum dissipation. So if we have it on the dead center, which is 80 milliamps, the plate voltage is 400 volts. The tube's running at 32 watts, which is 80% of its rated dissipation, which is a pretty nice spot to run a 300B tube. The far right mark, it pulls the plate voltage down to 388. We're now pulling 35 watts of dissipation, and we're now at 87.3, which is still a safe place to be. I'm not sure that's the happy spot for a 300B tube. They seem to be happier at around 80%, but I've run a lot of tubes at 90% in an SE amp and not had any issues. So you could bias this a little hotter if you wanted to, just to see what it sounds like, and it shouldn't make the tube red plate. So now we go into what happens when you swap in a pair of 5AR4s, which are more efficient rectifier tubes. And we can see the results here. We pick up about 20 volts on the plate over what the 274Bs do. So that gives us 430 volts on the plate, which at the far left mark is 28.8 watts, which is 72% of the tube's dissipation level. If you have it dead center, pulls the voltage down to 420. We're now at 33.6 watts, and we're at 84%, which honestly would be perfectly fine to run the tube there. Go to the far right mark, we're now at 412 volts on the plate. We're at 37.1 watts, and now we're starting to push the tube pretty hard. We're at almost 93% of its rated dissipation. And that's why we put this last column in. If I was running a pair of 5AR4 tubes, I would set it this one tick left of the center, which would put the plate voltage at 425. We're running just a breath over 32 watts, and we're right at 81% dissipation. Now, obviously, the meter's pretty sensitive as far as like a milliamp or two. It's almost hard to see. Plus, the adjuster screws are super sensitive, so I would just shoot for a little left of center if you're running 5AR4 tubes, and you would end up at the same dissipation levels as the meter centered with a 274B tube. So there we go. That's how you adjust the bias if you're going to be running a 5AR4 tube. So this is like a good place to wrap up this video. Well, as you can see from that earlier segment, why I like having indirectly heated rectifier tubes. The way that it pulls up the voltage slowly, and we are definitely going to be pulling that delay board out of this amp and wiring the power transformer directly to the rectifier tube. And I'll show you how to do that in the next video. It's basically soldering 2 wires in place. I mean, I know some of you guys are not good at soldering and stuff, and you know, I can't speak to that. I get the hesitancy, and you can just drop some 5AR4s in it and just call it a day. I do think pulling out that delay board and wiring these directly, allowing these 5AR4s to do their natural slow voltage ramp up thing, is worth doing. And again, earlier versions didn't have that board in it, but I'm also not sure what that first capacitor is on that power supply board, whether it's the 100 UF or the 220 UF. Now, if it is the 220 UF, there's a possibility of doing something less invasive, like either, pulling that board out and replacing that capacitor, or maybe even just putting another capacitor in series with it, which will lower the capacitance of that first cap. But it's probably going to be better to pull the board out and replace that capacitor if we need to. I'm not as concerned about having 100 UF being shared by 2 rectifier tubes, but I'd still rather do what I'm planning on doing in the future and using like a 47 or a 33 UF first cap, put 1 choke, then have another 100 UF cap with a second choke, and then the 330 UF. I think that's going to be the real solution here, and I think there's room inside this amp to do that. So I hope you're enjoying this content. If you are, please subscribe to the channel. Please like the video. Thanks again to you Patreon folks, and also you folks that make donations to my website that help me afford my other projects. And also thanks to the folks that drop ship me gear for me to review and share with you on the channel. And until the next video, have a nice day.